Welcome to Psychologist Talks. This is going to be the third episode in a series about antisocial personality disorder. Perhaps I should put in air quotes, antisocial personality disorder, because if you've listened or watched my first two episodes, you already know it's a massively flawed construct. And so every single episode shifts a little bit because of that. So when we look at other personality disorders, and if you listen to other episodes in my series, you'll hear me kind of shift things up. Well, it kind of depends on the subtypes. Well, it absolutely depends on the quote unquote subtypes, because we are at least talking about two different constructs underneath antisocial personality disorder. And this developmental episode is going to be no different. And so once again, you'll feel a little bit of a split. On the one hand, we're going to be talking about delinquency, conduct disorder, antisocial, maybe something on sort of the low end, and then bridge into sociopathy. You'll hear a lot of similarities between those two, just kind of an increase in severity. And then we hop over to psychopathy, which is in very many ways its own beast, as I've said multiple times before. And a very quick note on sadism, because once again, it's kind of in the same family that we're talking about here. So, broadly speaking, we're going to be talking most frequently about executive function issues and impulse control issues. We're going to talk about fight or flight responses and emotional regulation. We'll talk a lot about empathy and the capacity for it, never mind callousness, which you have heard quite a bit on the key features episode, as well as subtypes. And then what was the other one? I think just the impulse control in general. So those are the kind of common themes, and you'll start to see a deviation between these two groups. But let's just get down to business. Hopefully it'll make sense as we go. So let's first talk about kind of bottom of the barrel, quote unquote, general delinquency. There are a lot of pathways to delinquency. Remember, antisocial personality disorder, we're mostly talking about something that has to be frequent and recurrent enough. So this can't just be a one-off delinquency. We're talking about pretty chronic delinquency. And we see some biological differences with these individuals sometimes, and then we can see some environmental issues for sure, across a lot of these cases. So biologically, the prefrontal cortex is a lot of where executive functions live. You start to see some issues in this domain, and it kind of spreads out. It's not just the prefrontal cortex. We talk about emotional regulation system. These folks just essentially, they can run a little bit hot. They don't always plan in advance. They might be subject to just a sudden, this is what I'm going to do. Or when the fight or flight system is activated, they might act very rapidly, very quickly, based off of limited information. Some of this can be need gratification focused. Some of this can absolutely be related to a fear response. So again, there could be some biological factors. Now, if you're a forensic provider, or if you're in the forensic field at all, you might say, that's a dangerous argument to make, because are you saying that they're not responsible for their behavior? Oh, heavens no, they are indeed. People can work through these sorts of issues, but it would be, unwise. It would be not fair to these individuals to name that these biological differences can show up. But because we're talking about really a broad, ill-defined caption here, I wouldn't say that's the case with everybody. There's got to be probably a normal curve within this population, where there's some people it's more environmental factors, and others might be a little bit more biological. If you've been listening to my personality series long enough, you know my typical adage is usually the more severe it gets, the more biology is likely implicated. The severity can be, when we talk about antisociality, it could be like the severity of the crimes and the behavior themselves, or it could be like the chronicity and challenge of the individual to not engage in these behaviors, almost like they're destined to keep falling into the same rut. Not solely because of choices, because their biology is functioning quite differently. This has implications for treatment, right? When environmental factors are more implicated, that's going to look a little bit different than when biological factors are more implicated. Can we tell the difference easily just by glancing and talking to people? I don't know if we can, but I digress. So, The biological system, again, fight or flight response is a little bit off, tend to be highly reactive, more impulsive, et cetera, et cetera. Prefrontal cortex is probably the most implicated. Environmentally, this can look like a lot of different things. Inconsistent environments. This could be linked to parents themselves, but it could be the greater environment at large, whether it's unpredictable income and nourishment and safety and security. It can just activate fight or flight responses, which can result in internalizing conditions absolutely unrelated to something like antisocial personality disorder. But for those who are more prone towards externalizing, it is absolutely a risk factor. And you combine that with overt adversities and or traumas, it's really not a great mix that you're dealing with here. And then if you add on top of that sort of societal contextual factors, talk about like a quote unquote peer contagion, or this idea that they're just around other delinquency that can pull them into this. Now remember, a one-off here or there just because they're around other folks that do delinquent things. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about chronicity or a pattern. And this is why you get usually a marriage of a little bit of the two of these. What's interesting, when I was glancing around, I didn't see anything about substance use, but I would bargain one of the big differentiating factors here is if someone gets deep into substance use around the time of delinquent behavior, you would want to be pretty careful about making assumptions around personality disorder, because if someone's chronically high, or a lot of the behaviors are linked to seeking the attainment of a substance, I would really be careful about thinking about personality disorder unless you had some other evidence beyond the substance use. Remembering that if we're talking true blue antisocial, which even if it's a flawed construct, I think they're wise to point out this stuff starts cropping up at a pretty young age. Usually, not always, usually before the age that substance use becomes more recurrent and problematic. So those sort of things collide and can land people going down a path of delinquent behavior, antisociality, something like that. The end. Now, when we look at sociopathy, we basically just take everything I just said and increase the severity. So when we talk about the prefrontal cortex, my apologies, it's basically just absolutely on fire. These folks, true blue, you're going to see impulsivity, impulse issues at a really young age. Just recurrent issues. I would not be surprised that at a young age you're seeing behavioral issues in school, because this is just how they are. This does not have to be something that is provoked necessarily. This is more of just dispositionally how they operate and behave. Their sort of fight or flight response is really janky, and we're going to talk about environmental factors that worsen whatever is going on biologically beneath the surface already. This is where we also see empathy pathways that could be implicated a little bit more. If you recall from my first two episodes, if you watch them or listen to them, typically it's not like a lack of capacity outright. That is more reserved for psychopathy plus. But we could see a little bit of damage done here because they're loose cannons is what I called them in episode 2, the subtype. So that can be something that's starting to crop up for these individuals. Probably one of the most unique additions when we talk about this category informally known as sociopathy, or maybe I should say formally known, it's a common enough word, researched enough, is the presence of like trauma, like significant abuse and trauma that messes with attachment. And this is usually, the kind of in vogue term these days is like complex trauma. It's not like just a one-off trauma. These folks are usually subjected to really unsafe, really truly unpredictable environments that can lend to really disorganized attachments. And if you know anything about disorganized attachments, their their fear response is absolutely just janky and just not working right. And then you collide that with the other factors, the peer groups and those sorts of things. It is just an absolute recipe for disaster. Again, when we talk about, excuse me, my eye is itching quite a bit here. If you're listening, you're like, I can't see you itch your eye, but it's not that complex trauma. Just in case you're a lay person who's like, oh my God, does that mean people with complex trauma tend to go this route? No. Complex trauma, in my experience, at least this is, I say this, but I'm like, well, who actually seeks treatment? More often, it's an internalizing problem. But for these folks already prone to sort of externalizing related problems, the addition of the complex trauma is just it's a disaster waiting to happen. And this is where folks who might fall in the camp of sociopathy crop up. So that's kind of it for these two are very related, right? And then what we're gonna about to add is the callous, unemotional, lack of empathy. And then instead of dysregulation, this tendency towards impulse control and just flying off the handle of the loose cannon, we actually have far more affective control juxtaposed next to that lowered empathy. And usually the executive functions are a little bit more intact too. So again, we got more executive dysfunction, more emotional dysregulation, janky sort of fight or flight systems colliding with a lot of environmental factors. And here we go. Instead, heading into psychopathy, we have decreased empathy and increased capacity for callousness. The fight or flight response is actually quite calm. It is not overreactive. They tend to not to be as dysregulated. And they tend not to be as impulsive, especially the more quote-unquote successful ones. This is where, if you were listening in episode 2, these folks are sometimes hard to catch because they see and they're watching and they're planful. They are intentional. They are predatory in nature. It is not more of a behavioral dysregulation diagnosis we're talking about. We're talking about a precision about these folks. And so I'm kind of giving away the game here. This is what's going on. Biologically, everything I just talked about is where we're talking about here. There's a far more genetic, far more biological component to true blue psychopathy because that's how they tick. That is how they work. Now, there could be environmental factors. I mean, we're all subject. Doesn't matter what we're doing internally. We're all subject to our environment. So yeah, sure, peer groups could be a factor of it. Trauma and adversity could technically be a factor of this. But as I've said before, as we lean and kind of think about the treatment, it would be dangerous to assume the environmental factors are anything more than 51% of what's going on when we talk about psychopathy. Psychopathy, they are already marching to the beat of their own drum. And you can absolutely find them with parents that are relatively intact, right? Like systems around them that are relatively intact, but the biology does not care. The biology has a different motivation. You will hear kind of scary stories sometimes out of parents that, yeah, they could do better, but this kid is just like deceitful and callous and does these violent, creepy things at a young age. And that gives you the heebie-jeebies, if that's you know. I mean, it's just they're not good stories. Your own fight or flight is like, oh, that does not sound good. That is like a scary thing to hear. So it's really a different beast. What I don't know on the psychopathy front is, this is where like animal abuse, that kind of stuff can come up too. I should probably mention because I realized I didn't mention that in key features or anywhere else. But you can start to see, the animal abuse pop up. But I don't know. What I'm saying I don't know is like if there's like a softer version. The prototype in my head for psychopathy is like age 6, 8, something, right? You're already seeing some bad signs. Like this is chronic, like blatantly not good stuff. And then they begin to be able to lie and deceive better, right? The capacity for abstraction, the complexity of thoughts, higher cortical functions are just absolutely, expanding exponentially as they're hitting that teenage year. And then that's where they really develop more clever ways to go about things. They might get caught a little bit more, but this is where the snake can enter the grass and you don't see it anymore. That is what I typically understand of psychopathy. I might not be aware that there's other sort of developmental trajectories around psychopathy. So I just want to, name that. But for what it's worth, my general understanding is heavily biologically implicated and it usually starts early. Why? Because it's biological. It's not like just they fall into the wrong crowd and run into some traumas and boom, you got a psychopath. It's already there, bacon. I'm getting ready. Like baking, not like bacon, like pig bacon. All right, I'm losing my train of thought here. All right, get to the final one. And if you've listened to the subtypes episode, you already know what I'm going to say when it comes to sadism. It's basically psychopathy, but instead of the decreased sort of fight or flight response and the decreased emotionality, instead, sadism has this sort of pain-pleasure perversion where there is this sort of gratification and excitement seeking through the pain of others. And so there's a really sort of messed up internal system of like what our gratification centers respond to. And, this is especially, you see animal abuse and the assaults and stuff at a really young age. And the kid not only was just like nonplussed by like, oh, they got hurt or I terrorized that person or, it killed that animal. Oh, well, beneath the surface, if you get it out of them, they're like, that was really pleasurable. It was really enjoyable. I don't know much when it comes to like neurobiology or like why, like what is the mechanism in there. I really don't understand that. Maybe that's something I need to deeper dive into to really try to understand if there's even research on sadists. I don't know. But again, it's everything psychopathy, all the biology implicated. There's just this extra layer here of some perversion. I think the other potential, addition with sadism is the experience of traumas that can add that extra flair. So if you think about someone who's already biologically ticking different, and then they are subjected to some really messed up, we're talking like physical, sexual, torture-esque, really not good traumas. Perhaps, this is me speculating again, perhaps there is this, because they don't have the same affective interpersonal system as most of us, how they internalize that trauma perhaps in the backwards way goes from like a need gratification, it's all about me and I just don't care, to maybe it flares off something uniquely that creates a sadistic sort of mentality in how they do things. Is that accurate? I don't know. But forgive me, I don't tend to plan for these for hours, so I'm just kind of rolling with it. I don't know. Maybe if I run into something or if I do some research, I'll make another episode or an amendment episode or something like that. But I'll leave it at that. Right? Rather than overcomplicating things, I'll pause there, or I'll stop there really. So just to recap, in case I kind of got things disorganized there at the end, remember we're talking about dysregulation, impulse control issues implicated for delinquency and traditional, quote unquote, whatever the heck we're talking about, antisociality, all the way up to sociopathy. Sociopathy, probably the most unique added variable, is going to be pretty significant trauma, messing with attachment and further messing with underlying self-regulatory capacities. And then, like I've said in every single episode, when we add that callous, unemotional bit, things start to get real weird, real off, and that's where we're treading into psychopathy. And with that, no or little issues with dysregulation and impulse control. We're talking about precise predation when we're talking about psychopathy, and then the addition of the sadistic piece with the sadists. So there you go. So that's the end of the developmental episode. I'll be doing a treatment episode. I've already spoken a little bit about that. It should be a pretty short episode. Then I got to figure out if I'm going to do anything else beyond that. So as always, thank you for listening and watching, and stay curious.